Evening, everyone. My name is Jess Keating, and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity here in McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. I'm so happy to welcome you to the first session in our fall webinar series, Conversations That Matter, the Intersection of Justice and Pregnancy. My hope is that each semester we can gather to reflect on timely issues of importance that strike at the heart of human dignity, and that these conversations will be an opportunity for us to recommit ourselves to that vision which was articulated by Peter Morin, one of the co-founders of the Catholic Worker, who said, "It's our vision to create a society where it is easier to be good." And if I might add my own gloss, a society where it is easier to choose life. Few issues divide our country or are as contested as the issue of abortion. Yet, as a recent national interview-based study commissioned by the McGrath Institute for Church Life showed, for the vast majority of Americans, views about pregnancy and abortion are nothing if not profoundly complex and ambiguous. Yet again and again, those who were interviewed expressed a desire for opportunities to have conversations about the complex issues surrounding abortion and how to build a society that supports women and children. And so, in conversation with various partners and guided by the conviction of the inestimable worth and value of every human life and a commitment to building a civilization of love, we decided to convene a series of conversations focusing on the intersection of justice and pregnancy. Future sessions in our webinar series will explore the sociocultural realities that influence women's decision-making during pregnancy, including the interpersonal and policy-based support that promotes life, and the demands of justice in walking with women through pregnancy and beyond childbirth. In tonight's session, we'll explore the intertwined historical roots of the human rights vision of social justice and the defense of the unborn. By returning to the origins of the pro-life movement, origins which have largely been forgotten, we hope we can illuminate the interrelationship of justice and pregnancy that will encourage us to think anew about this relationship in our contemporary context. And to help us do this, we've asked Professor Daniel K. Williams, the leading scholar in the history of the pro-life movement, to speak with us this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Daniel Williams is a professor of history at the University of West Georgia, where he teaches courses in modern American history and the history of American religion and politics. He holds a PhD from Brown University and a BA in history and classics from Case Western Reserve University. Professor Williams is the author of 3 books on religion and politics in modern America, including God's Own Party, The Making of the Religious Right, published with Oxford University Press in 2010. And what is perhaps most relevant for this seminar, Defenders of the Unborn, the pro-life movement before Roe v. Wade, also with Oxford in 2016. And I would say this is essential reading for anyone who seeks to understand better the history of the pro-life movement in the United States. Professor Williams' most recent book was published earlier this year by the University Press of Kansas. It is a study of the 1976 presidential election titled The Election of the Evangelical, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and the Presidential Contest of 1976. His next book, which is forthcoming this March and will be published by Erdman's, is The Politics of the Cross, a Christian alternative to partisanship. He has also authored numerous articles on the politics of abortion, as well as other contemporary social and political issues in publications like First Things, Christianity Today, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, as well as numerous articles in academic journals. And you can read his monthly blog on the first Wednesday of each month at the Anxious Bench Patheos. He has also spoken at a number of university pro-life conferences, including 2 appearances at the Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life at Georgetown University. Professor Williams and his wife Nadia, who is also a professor of history at the University of Western Georgia, have 3 children and live in Carrollton, Georgia, where they are active members and Sunday school teachers at a pro-life evangelical Presbyterian church. Welcome, Professor Williams.
Well, thank you, Jess. I appreciate that kind introduction, especially your willingness to invite me to speak tonight. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Okay, well, my question for this evening, is the pro-life movement a better fit for political conservatism or political liberalism? And as the next slide shows, my argument in the next 25 minutes is that the pro-life movement in its historic form was a natural fit for the New Deal and Great Society version of American liberalism in the mid-20th century. And many of the people who created the modern American pro-life movement were liberals of this variety. But that may answer the historical question, but we can still ask the question, is the pro-life movement still a natural fit for human rights liberalism? Should it be? Or has the pro-life movement evolved into something else? Those are the questions that we're going to be examining this evening. I'll try to get through as much of this material as I can, but if I don't, I'll cut it off to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Well, if we went back 48 years to the first pro-life rally on the Mall in Washington, D.C., there would be no question that the pro-life movement was liberal. The keynote speaker and organizer at that event was the Reverend Richard John Newhouse, whom of course most of you know as Father Newhouse, who later became a Catholic, but at the time was a liberal Lutheran minister. He had just come from the Democratic National Convention, where he had been an advocate, or he had been a delegate for George McGovern, and he gave a rousing address that linked the issue of abortion to the war in Vietnam, and of course he opposed both. So did the students who came out for the event. The pro-life movement is not a conservative event, they insisted. As Sue Baster said there, Sue Bastier, the pro-life movement is actually a very liberal group. So what does liberal mean in this context? The mid-20th century pro-life movement was liberal, I would say, in the sense that it was predicated on a belief in universal human rights, and it sought to expand the power of the federal government in order to protect the rights and provide for social welfare through increased funding for social services as part of a larger human rights vision. So what do I mean by all that? Well, what I mean is that the pro-life movement was founded on the same sort of ideals that the New Deal and Great Society shared. And the New Deal and the Great Society were both attempts to protect human dignity and fight poverty that the creators believed might be a threat to that human dignity by insisting on these fundamental principles of human rights. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the pro-life movement originated at this time of New Deal and Great Society liberalism, primarily among Democrats who shared those views. Well, the pro-life movement developed as a response initially against utilitarianism. Now, why is that important? What that means, I think, is that although the pro-life movement eventually saw its mission as fighting a counter rights claim, that is, the pro-choice movement making the case that abortion was a fundamental right. Initially, the proponents of legalized abortion made utilitarian arguments, saying that legalized abortion would improve society, that you would reduce the death rate for women who were otherwise subject, they believed, to dangerous illegal abortions, that you would prevent children from being born in the world who would otherwise not be cared for. Those are all utilitarian arguments. And against these arguments, the original pro-lifers, who were overwhelmingly Catholic initially, later on Protestants would join the movement, but initially they were overwhelmingly Catholic, they made natural law arguments that then evolved into rights-based arguments that came through that natural law tradition. And these arguments said that the unborn child is a full human person who has the absolute right to live, and that utilitarian arguments that try to minimize that are essentially a violation of a fundamental principle on which all other human rights might rest. Well, this was coupled with a larger social welfare program at first, a program of living wage, program of the rights of labor unions, of the rights of workers, of other protections of human dignity, rights to education. And initially, this seemed to be something that liberals were receptive to. The UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child, for example, guaranteed the rights of children before as well as after birth. And state and federal courts, which tended to be dominated by New Deal style liberals in the 1940s and 1950s, affirmed the personhood of the fetus in numerous tort cases before the 1960s. So in the mid-20th century, this human rights argument seemed to work. There was this natural link, people believed, between the prevailing liberalism of the era and these rights claims on behalf of the unborn. So what happened? In 1959, the American Law Institute began making a utilitarian argument in favor of liberalizing abortion laws. They primarily wanted to prevent the dangers of illegal abortion and, as I said, bring abortion law into the second half of the 20th century to update for modern medical concerns that really hadn't been an issue when these laws were passed at the end of the 19th century. But in response to that, the pro-life movement appealed to the Constitution, appealing to the 14th Amendment, saying that there's an absolute constitutional right to life, not just a natural rights argument in the abstract, but actually a civil rights argument. And it's striking that they appealed to the 14th Amendment because that amendment that says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that was the same amendment that on which the civil rights movement's key court cases were based, including Brown versus Board of Education. Now, despite that argument, between 1967 and 1970, 13 states liberalized their abortion laws, largely along the lines that the American Law Institute had suggested. And what's also striking is that most of the governors who signed these bills into law were Republicans. Now, why is that the case? It's not the case that every Republican governor supported this, but nevertheless, there were certain reasons why Republicans tended, in general, to favor these bills. One is the libertarian argument that the state should not interfere in private medical decisions, and that was Barry Goldwater's argument. Barry Goldwater was the Republican presidential nominee of 1964, and during the 1960s was probably the nation's most well-known conservative before he was largely superseded by Ronald Reagan. Another was the so-called progressive argument that abortion law liberalization would bring the law into accord with modern medicine. There's the religious freedom argument from the Protestant perspective that the pro-life movement was a Catholic sectarian movement and that Protestants and Jews supported abortion law liberalization. And the fact that they could link the pro-life movement with the perceived failed Catholic campaign against contraceptives meant that they could marginalize this as a sectarian movement that really had no place in politics. If conservative Republicans tended to be supportive of abortion rights, liberal Republicans were far more so. And in fact, the nation's most liberal abortion law, the most permissive abortion law, was signed into law by a Republican governor who had spent years strongly supporting it and advocating for it. That was Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Well, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed this bill into law in 1970, and it removed almost all restrictions on abortion up to the 24th week of pregnancy. It was one of the few laws passed before 1973 that were largely in compliance with Roe v. Wade, that is, could remain on the books essentially unchanged. And with this law in place, about 200,000 abortions per year were performed in New York hospitals because there was no residency requirement. And so women from throughout the United States could travel to New York to obtain abortions. What happened as a result was that there was a nationwide backlash among groups that had previously not been particularly supportive of the pro-life movement. Evangelical Protestants who had never really supported elective abortion on demand, but who had been cautiously willing to give at least some support to the early abortion liberalization laws of the late 1960s, began writing more forcefully against abortion after the New York law was passed. And a lot more women joined the movement as this campaign became, as it became obvious that the pro-choice campaign was becoming linked with the pro-choice movement. A number of women became more prominent spokespersons in the pro-life movement to counter that. So I just gathered together a more or less randomly selected group of leaders of pro-life organizations who were women. And you can see a few familiar faces if you're familiar with pro-life history, particularly Mildred Jefferson, may be a familiar name to some, maybe Ellen McCormick, who ran for president in 1976. But one of the things that you'll notice if you know something about these women's history is that none of these people would really be viewed in the early 1970s as political conservatives. Marjorie Mecklenburg was active in the campaign of Democratic presidential candidate Sargent Shriver in 1976. Mildred Jefferson was a civil rights advocate who was the first African-American woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School, and she was registered as a political independent for many years until finally in the 1980s, she changed her registration to Republican as she could see the political division in the parties. Ellen McCormick remained a Democrat even into the 1980s and of course ran for president as a Democrat. And Mary Winter always referred to herself as a feminist and tended to position herself on the left. A number of other women active in the movement, especially associated with Marjorie Mecklenburg, tended to link this cause to opposition to the Vietnam War. And speaking of that, one of the more prominent pro-life spokespersons of the early 1970s was Father Paul Marks, who on issues of sexuality tended to be very conservative. But as you can see from this picture, if you look very carefully, you'll notice he's wearing an anti-war pen. And that was not unusual. When people were speaking out against abortion, they often linked this issue to the Vietnam War. This was true of Catholic clergy at all levels in the early 1970s, and it was also true of some of the members of the pro-life organizations who were either laity or not even affiliated with the church at all. Strikingly, this argument did have some resonance among prominent liberals. Senator Ted Kennedy, for example, issued a very forceful pro-life statement in 1971, saying that society should, quote, fulfill its responsibility to its children from the very moment of conception. Jesse Jackson went even further by actually writing articles for pro-life magazines like the National Right to Life News. And here's a picture of his article, quick picture of his article from January 1977, called How We Respect Life is the Moral Issue, saying that everything links back to this question of how we treat life in the womb. So we might ask the question, well, what happened? How did this link between liberalism and the pro-life movement become severed? Because I think all of us are well aware that this is not exactly the case today. And I want to just quickly go through a few things in the last few minutes of this presentation to give you a sense of what happened. Well, the first thing is that the abortion rights campaign became a women's rights cause. And when that happened, and when Roe v. Wade sided with that rights-based argument over the rights-based argument that the pro-life movement was making, it became easier for the Democratic Party that was moving in the direction of pro-feminism anyway, to side with what was perceived as the women's rights position. And so Senator Ted Kennedy reversed his position on abortion in 1975. And in turn, the pro-life movement moved in the direction of an alliance with political conservatism. So, for example, when the National Right to Life Committee made the Human Life Amendment its highest priority in the 1970s, and when the Democratic Party refused to support it, but the Republican Party endorsed it in 1976, many people, including Mildred Jefferson and quite a number of others who had once either been Democrats or had been more liberal in their views, switched party registration or at least began working with conservatives. Well, this increased, the support for the Republican Party increased with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was one of the people behind the endorsement, behind the Republican Party's endorsement of the Human Life Amendment in 1976, and when he ran for president in 1980, and then again for re-election in 1984, the Republican Party passed even stronger resolutions in support of the pro-life cause and of the Human Life Amendment in particular. Now, some people could sort of see the writing on the wall and were a little disturbed by this new alliance between the pro-life movement and political conservatism. Perhaps most well known among the people who were somewhat cautious about this was Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, who was advocate of what he called a consistent life or a seamless garment life ethic in the 1980s. And in particular, what he wanted to do was to link the pro-life movement to opposition to nuclear arms buildup, as well as opposition to capital punishment and support of other human life causes. It would all be based in the defense of unborn human life, but that defense of unborn human life would then give rise to a variety of other rights-based claims. And actually, that seamless garment ethic was remarkably similar to, say, what the nation's Catholic bishops had argued for in the late 1940s. They had argued for something very similar, not necessarily about nuclear arms buildup, but about that the unborn child had an absolute right to life. They linked that claim with a variety of other rights-based claims, viewing it as foundational, but certainly not the sole rights-based claim that they wanted to push. Well, what happened to that consistent life ethic? Because I think we're aware that neither party really adopted it. And I want to just say quickly, I'll mention three reasons why this consistent life ethic broke down. The first one is the Democratic Party made a defense of abortion rights a political litmus test, which I think we're all aware of, that after 1984, it became impossible for any potential presidential nominee in the Democratic Party, or even vice presidential nominee for that matter, to take anything less than an absolutist position in defense of abortion rights, that access to abortion was what the Democratic Party platform called a fundamental right to reproductive freedom. Secondly, the pro-life movement realized that it could not pass the Human Life Amendment, and so it turned to other strategies. And in particular, number three, the pro-life movement turned to a judicial strategy to change the Supreme Court. Now, it's somewhat fortuitous, I think, that we're having this seminar this week. We didn't know this, of course, when we scheduled it, that this would be a week when we were beginning a national discussion about changing the Supreme Court, but lo and behold, that's what happened. And so if we look at the court in 1973, we have Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision. Strikingly, one of the two dissenters was a Democratic appointee, Byron White. The other one was a Republican appointee, William Rehnquist. But after the Reagan administration began trying a judicial strategy to push the court to the right on multiple issues, not just abortion, but the pro-life movement signed on to that strategy. And in 1992, they ended up with a 5-4 split in favor of reaffirming Roe. Now, this was actually a disappointment to pro-lifers because they were sure that the 5-4 decision would go the other way. They really believed that they had a voice on their side with Justice Kennedy that Reagan had appointed, and they were deeply disappointed that he didn't join them. But be that as it may, that it was still evident that the court had shifted on the issue of abortion, and that the key to that shift had been Reagan and Bush's judicial appointments. So when President Trump took office in 2017, the court was still a 5-4 split, and this had been true for years. There was the hope that the court would, under a Republican president and with a Republican Senate, shift even further to the right on abortion, and that's where we are right now. That for the last year, people have believed, whether rightly or wrongly, but have believed that they might have 5 anti-Roe votes, or at least 5 votes in support of upholding legislation that restricts abortion to a certain extent. And now, of course, with the Supreme Court once again in play, we may be poised for yet a further shift of the court on this issue. Now, let me just say something quickly about how we would assess these strategies and what all this means, because I think a lot of this is probably familiar to many of you. But then the question is, what do we do with this information? And what I would say would be that, first of all, this focus on changing the court has created a partisan alliance between the pro-life movement and the Republican Party that has alienated nearly all people that would once have called themselves pro-life Democrats, precisely because there is no way to pursue the fundamental strategy of the pro-life movement without aligning with a larger conservative judicial philosophy, and in particular, the Republican presidents and Republican senators who would support justices who hold that policy. So whether this is a good idea or a bad idea is something we can discuss a little bit later, but it's just a fact of life that the way that the pro-life movement has now defined itself has made its partisan identity very evident in a way that certainly was not true in the 1970s. But secondly, I would also say that this focus has largely eclipsed the earlier goal of the pro-life movement. If we looked at the early 1970s, the goals of the pro-life movement were, number one, protect human life in law, and number two, create a society of life. Unfortunately, if you're in the mold of those early 70s pro-lifers, the pro-life movement today doesn't really have those goals. They have those goals on paper, but most of the political resources for the pro-life movement have been focused on creating barriers to abortion access, because that's the only thing that can be done. Roe v. Wade has not been overturned, and the Human Life Amendment is really impossible to pass. And so people haven't really made a serious attempt to do that since the 1980s. So that has largely alienated a lot of African Americans who might have otherwise been supporters of the movement. In the 1970s, African Americans were even more likely than white Catholics to identify themselves as opponents of abortion. Today, that's not true at all. Now, this strategy has been successful in some ways. Between 2011 and 2014, to just give you one statistic, states adopted 231 new abortion restrictions. Now, a lot of those were struck down by the courts, but still this shows the potential that can happen when the pro-life movement allies itself with conservative Republicans in favor of these abortion barriers. It's also true that the abortion rate in the United States has plummeted in recent years. Why that has happened is a matter of debate. It's complicated. People don't agree on why it is the case. But I can say that it's probably true that the barriers to abortion access have had something to do with that decline. We are now at a point where the number of abortions is at its lowest level ever. The abortion rate is below that of 1973. And yet, at the same time, the percentage of people having abortions who are in poverty is higher than ever. To take our most recent statistics, nearly 50% of American women, 49% to be exact, who have abortions today are below the poverty line, and an additional 26% are low income. So what that essentially means is that 75% of the women having abortions today are coming in with very few economic resources. Most of them have had at least one child. Most of them are in their 20s, and the vast majority are unmarried. So that leads to a question. What would be the best way to lower the abortion rate? And I will say this, that it is not entirely clear that that should be the main goal of the pro-life movement, or the only goal of the pro-life movement. That protecting human life in public law is certainly a goal. But if we just ask the question about lowering the abortion rate, it's unclear to me that the reversal of Roe will accomplish that, or that it would certainly not end legal abortion in the United States. If Roe is overturned, the nation's largest abortion providers, that is those in New York and California in particular, would probably continue to expand their abortion services. Much of the South and Great Plains, of course, would probably ban or greatly restrict abortion, but the number of abortions that occur in those states are rather low anyway. Probably to take the perspective of the pro-life liberals of the early 1970s, if one's goal is to create a society in which human life is valued, then simply focusing on the reversal of Roe will probably not necessarily accomplish that. It would give states greater freedom, but it would not actually accomplish the goal that the people who were active in the movement in the early 1970s had, which is creating a pro-life society. So I'll conclude with this question. What would be the best pro-life strategy today? If you were to ask the two of the leading pro-life advocates of the early 1970s, Sargent and Eunice Kennedy Shriver, they would have said that what they would really want to do would be to create positive alternatives to abortion, and that the creation of that economic assistance would probably create, in turn, a society of life. Now, not everyone would necessarily agree with that strategy, and in fact, even a lot of pro-life liberals of the early 1970s or mid-1970s did not agree with that. Sargent and Eunice Kennedy Shriver ended up leaving the pro-life movement because of its focus on the Human Life Amendment. Many pro-life liberals did favor the Human Life Amendment. But what's striking is that by rejecting that strategy, the pro-life movement ended up not getting the Human Life Amendment, but not getting that society that valued life either. So perhaps, in conclusion, what we could say is that a pro-life strategy that is linked to those early years of the movement would probably be a pro-life strategy that has as its goal not simply the passage of an abortion restriction and an extra barrier, but rather a holistic view that would say, what can we do to create a society that values life at every level, certainly including the unborn, but continuing on at every level to a natural death. That was the historic goal of the pro-life movement. And one can understand, of course, why the pro-life movement ended up looking at a particular partisan strategy as a way to accomplish that. But maybe 45 years after this began to emerge, it's time to look back and say, is there something in those early pro-life voices that perhaps we could learn from today? Thanks. I'll open it up to Q&A.
Professor Williams, thank you so much for your remarks. I will start us off with a question. Professor Williams, you mentioned the population control movement. Could you say a little bit more about the influence of the population control movement in the unfolding of abortion legislation, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You're right. I sort of offered this tantalizing tease by showing you two slides on that and then skimming past it without really talking about it. In the late 1960s, especially after Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, there was a widespread view among a lot of liberals that there were too many people in the world. That is, that if the current population growth rate continued, that the world would run out of resources by the end of the 1970s. That was a widespread belief, and that helped to link some liberals who were not necessarily human rights liberals, but people who would call themselves progressive Democrats, and for that matter, a number of Republicans, to the cause of abortion rights, saying that while legalized abortion was certainly not their only strategy for fighting population growth, in a world that needed fewer people, it was important to legalize every measure that, short of infanticide, we hope, but every measure that might reduce the population. Most people in the United States would qualify that by saying through voluntary means. Obviously, there were some other countries like China that chose to do it through more coercive means. But in the United States, the focus was on voluntary means. And I would say that in reading through the correspondence of, say, California's legalization of abortion in the late 1960s, that was certainly a concern. It never existed alone, But the Rockefeller family, particularly Nelson Rockefeller's brother, John D. Rockefeller III, was a population control advocate, a longtime population control advocate. And so that's a part of the abortion rights movement's history that I think today tends to be de-emphasized, in large part that I think the movement itself would like to portray itself primarily as a women's rights movement. And it did become that. But I would say that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, up through at least 1972, in organizations like NARAL, those two visions, that is the feminist vision and the population control vision, coexisted in almost equal measure. And it really wasn't until 1973 and afterwards that it became clear that the women's rights narrative would prevail. That's the way that the movement would market itself, and the overt population control concerns tended to drop. I think in the pro-choice movement, there's generally been a prevailing cultural view that there was something to the population control movement, but in terms of actual advocacy on that particular issue, I think that dropped off markedly after about 1973.
Thank you so much. Gail Biederman has a question. Gail will unmute you.
Thank you. First, I want to say I'm a major fan. I love your book. As soon as I read it, like everything changed. And I say this as somebody who is a historian of women. I suppose you want to say. I started out pro-choice. I'm now in the mushy middle. So I feel like people need to know this before one starts, right? So can I offer a sort of an added narrative to yours, which I think gets to a similar place, which is focusing on, if you will, not just feminism, but radical feminism, which was in some ways the more powerful, long-standing, they're the people who sort of argued around bracketing off NARAL. They're the ones who came up with a variety of the complicated arguments, right? Does that make sense? So that, yeah. I mean, first is a sort of which you know this already because he knows everything about this stuff. If you start talking about the liberals and the conservatives in 1970s and 60s and 70s, that leaves out most of the young activists who considered themselves radicals and considered liberals a dirty word. Many of you probably remember that, you know. Does that make sense? You can argue with me later if that's okay. Can I just because I'm so excited every time I read your stuff, it makes me excited.
Yeah, I think you're right that there was, what you're getting at in that question, I think, is the perceived sharp division that is perceived, meaning people on the ground who were young, who were part of the baby boom generation, perceived a sharp division between what's sometimes called the new left and traditional liberalism. Liberalism was associated with...
I mean, now is disgusting as far as most of the people who are women.
Right.
So the problem is all these people who consider themselves radicals, right? And they came out with a lot of the, free abortion on demand. This is why we need to have this. Eventually they merge with now, and it's kind of all mixed up later by 72, right? They don't think they're liberals, but they are, is what I'm going to try to say. Because you cannot be pro-choice without coming up for rights. That's a liberal sort of a thing. With me so far? So just to jump ahead, since then, few feminist theorists would go for liberalism unless you're Sheryl Sandberg, right? Or you're just sort of not thinking about it. Liberal theorists of all kinds are critical of feminist theorists, people who call themselves feminists, tend to be liberals, tend to be critical of rights-based claims all over the place, right? What I want to suggest is, if what we're going for is on the one hand to say, look at what the real liberal pro-life people were going for in Mecklenburg and so forth, and they were going for, if you will, providing for human needs. I think that's where you go and you pick up the people, the sort of the heirs of the radical feminists too, because they're no longer saying, well, we just have to defend rights. People are saying, looking at people of color, looking at poverty and so forth and so on. You see where I'm going with this now, or not exactly? Because
I think that's a good point.
Get together a different type of, precisely because most people who get abortions are poor and Black and they can't afford the kid. That's a feminist argument for a much broader support for people, 18 years of education and housing and so forth and so on. Does that work?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the point. Good observation. Okay, I've seen a whole bunch of questions roll in.
Yeah,
I'm able
okay.
to quickly read them, but yeah, if we can, I'm going to try to
So,
take these a little bit more quickly. But yeah, go ahead, read the next one, and I'll see if I can answer it succinctly.
great. We have a question from Stephanie Smith.
Hi. My question is, how do we begin to detach the pro-life movement from a particular political party in order to embrace a more consistent ethic of life, considering that neither political party really embraces that that ethic? And I have found, I teach theology at a Catholic high school, and I found that in kind of trying to make a pro-life argument to students, their only experience with pro-life is just from the issue of abortion, and they don't see a consistent ethic, which sort of downgrades the argument that I think pro-life people are trying to make, because they are affiliated with a political party, and so they support like the death penalty or other issues that are really not part of that consistent ethic. So how do you see us begin to detach that from one political like partisan?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, and I guess I would say this, that the first step would be to make your pro-life identity much stronger than your partisan identity. In other words, partisan identity is only a strategy. It's only a means to an end. And so if say a Republican Party strategy works at a particular time, maybe it would make sense to identify with the Republican Party, but only insofar as it accomplishes this larger goal. Our principles need to be our primary identity, and the partisanship needs to be a distant second. But secondly, I would say that we need to distinguish between principles and strategy. And that's where I think the pro-life movement probably made a mistake in the 1970s and 1980s. First, in the 1970s, they insisted that the Human Life Amendment was a litmus test for being pro-life. And when I say they, what I mean is the nation's major pro-life organizations, particularly National Right to Life Committee, but also a number of others. And while the Human Life Amendment, I think most of those who are pro-life would say is a wonderful idea, it's unclear to me that it was a good idea to push that as the only pro-life strategy at that particular point in time. Clearly, they didn't get that. And so are there other things that one can do to become, to move society in a pro-life direction? And again, in the late 1980s, the same thing happened with the judicial strategy with the Supreme Court. And so if we can welcome internal dialogue and disagreement in the pro-life movement, if we can say that someone may be voting Democratic and still disagree with the Democratic Party's stance on abortion, their stated stance on abortion, but view that as a pro-life strategy because they believe that, say, the Democratic Party's stance on healthcare or on something else will create a more pro-life society in which women would be empowered to not choose abortion if they're choosing abortion for economic reasons, as a lot of the data seems to indicate. That sort of dialogue, I think, would be welcome. And of course, others may not make that particular choice. There might be some people who would vote Republican who would say that no, the judicial strategy is the best way to create a pro-life society. But I think we need to welcome that internal dialogue, that the pro-life movement would be broader and richer for having that sort of dialogue rather than narrowly tying us to a particular strategy that, by the way, hasn't accomplished its goal after several decades. So that's what I would say would be the first step toward becoming detached from party and making a bipartisan but critical stance. We need to hold parties accountable. We need to say that the Democratic Party has made statements on abortion that are absolutely wrong. The Republican Party, from a consistent life perspective, has made statements that are equally wrong. And but once we detach ourselves from the parties, we'll be able to make those critical statements. To yes, use parties as tools, voting for a party at particular points in time, but not making that our primary identity.
Great, that leads us into our next question, which is from John Michael Hogue. We can't find him, so I'll read his question. He says, Professor Williams, do you see hope as others like Professor Charles Camosy do, that we are in a moment of party realignment that presents opportunities for the emergence of a party which is wholeheartedly embraces a consistent ethic of life?
Yeah, I love Charles Camosy's work. We have talked with conferences before, corresponded. I've written a piece for his blog at one point in time. And so I would certainly endorse his work. But I say all that as preface to this, that I personally do not share his optimism that we're ready for a third party. And I say that as a historian of American politics. We have never, since the 1850s, had a viable third party in the United States. We have had a handful of parties that have potentially pushed the mainstream parties in a particular direction. And so that's always possible, but in recent years, it's difficult to say that has even happened substantially. I see the particular moment that we're in as a moment of increased party polarity and increased partisan identity. That one news report this morning essentially showed that the percentage of undecided voters in this particular election is at record low levels, unusually low levels. That essentially we are in a polarized climate in which Americans have lined themselves up on either side, not necessarily out of embracing the parties. Many of the people who are voting are not particularly happy about their choices, but there's a general recognition that in a polarized climate, these are the choices available. So I guess I don't see the same indications that Professor Camosi would, that we're moving toward a rejection of parties. That the clearest indication of that was probably during the 1970s. In the 1970s, it really seemed to many people, and there was good data to support this, that Americans had become disillusioned with both parties. But yet the end result was simply increased partisanship to perhaps an even greater degree. So based on historical trends, recurring patterns over and over in US history, as well as structural factors that are in place, like the Electoral College, like other things that are also deeply ingrained in our political system, or even our constitutional order, it's really difficult to imagine, for me to imagine, the sort of third-party approach that Charles Camosi seems to envision. Nevertheless, what I would say to people is that should be on the table. And so if you're convinced that that's a viable option that you want to invest in, I think there's a lot of merit in that. I think certainly one can vote with a cleaner conscience, perhaps, if one votes third party some of the time. It's just, if the larger question is that going to change the American political system? I would say I'll be very surprised if it does. Maybe pleasantly surprised, but very surprised nonetheless.
So my question was, your look back historically went back to, I guess, like the 1920s or late 1800s. And my question was, can you speak historically even further back than that? Let's go back a couple millennia. In civilized society, of course, there are always cases of abortion throughout history. We see that, but it wasn't a generalized practice, and it didn't seem to be connected to poverty so much as the world was generally poorer over the past couple thousand years than it is today, especially when we look at our own country. So my question is, why do you think civilization itself changed so drastically in these last few decades or the last 100 years compared to the last 1,000 or 2,000 years to where people think it is morally acceptable to abort unborn children? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So first, let me just push back a little bit. This is kind of a minor point, but if we go back exactly 2 millennia to the ancient Roman Empire, there was quite a bit of disrespect for unborn and recently born human life with widespread infanticide. So I'm not sure that we could go back, that we would say that this was an era of greater morality when it came to this issue. Instead, it was an era in which I think Christianity ended up changing the culture in a very positive way. But one of the reasons that a number of early Christian writers spoke out against abortion and infanticide, including in the Didache, is precisely because it was practiced. So, but with that caveat aside, I think we have seen a shift, and particularly today, the connection between poverty and abortion, I think, is also closely correlated with the breakdown of marriage. I think it's, when you look at single parenthood today, about 40% of all births in the US are to single parents, to single mothers. And at the beginning, it appears that a lot of those single mothers believe that they will be able to raise a child on their own or with an extended family network. And so most abortions are actually taking place for the second or third child that a woman conceives. But at some point in this process, I think it becomes clear to a lot of these women that this is not going to be an easy journey. And so while I do think one way to reduce the abortion rate would be to have economic assistance, there's also, I think that should go hand in hand. If we just look at the data, it should go hand in hand with efforts to promote marriage or to make marriage sustainable. Now, how we can do that is a much larger question that maybe go beyond what I can get into here in the time that we have remaining. But the fact that 85% of women who have abortion are unmarried shows that there is a pretty high correlation between not having a partner able to support the children that are brought into the world through that relationship, and feeling that maybe this is just unsustainable, and that abortion is the best answer. It does seem from the evidence, that anecdotal evidence at least, and even some statistical evidence, that the women who choose abortion are often not very happy with that choice when they're choosing it, that they view it as the best of a lot of bad options. And so I'm not sure that there's necessarily a cultural acceptance of abortion that is driving that choice, as much as simply a feeling of desperation and a belief that they are very much alone. There are a lot of individual stories. Some of those, of course, wouldn't conform to this pattern that I've outlined. But if we're looking for broad cultural trends, broad explanations that might get at the sort of cultural shift that you're talking about, I think that would be one that I would point to.
Professor Williams, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening. And